The story of human history is often written in the stark, simple ink of heroes and villains. We crave these clear divisions, these moral certainties, for they make the chaotic narrative of our past easier to comprehend. We place our champions on pedestals of impeccable marble and cast our monsters into pits of well-deserved obscurity. But what happens when the marble cracks? What do we do when the hero, the symbol of all we hold righteous and good, is revealed to be flawed, fragile, and ultimately human? This is not a story of simple darkness, but of faded light. It is a story that forces us to confront the most uncomfortable of questions. Can a lifetime of righteous struggle be undone by a single, catastrophic failure of moral leadership? This is the story of a woman who was once the living embodiment of hope for millions, a winner of the world's most prestigious prize for peace, who would later stand before the world and deny the very atrocities that prize was meant to prevent. Her name is Aung San Suu Kyi. And this is the profound, unsettling tragedy of the hero who failed. To understand the weight of her story, we must first journey to the country that forged her, defined her, and would ultimately break her spirit. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is a land of breathtaking beauty and deep-seated complexity. A nation nestled between the giants of India and China, its history is a tapestry woven with threads of ancient Buddhist kingdoms, colonial subjugation, and brutal military rule. For centuries, the Konbaung dynasty ruled over a sovereign Burmese kingdom until the expansionist ambitions of the British Empire culminated in 3 Anglo-Burmese wars throughout the 19th century. By 1885, the last Burmese king, Thibaw, was deposed and exiled, and Burma was made a province of British India. The colonial era extracted immense wealth in teak, rubber, and precious gems, but it also sowed the seeds of deep ethnic division, administering the Burman majority in the central heartland separately from the myriad ethnic states on the periphery, the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan, and the Rohingya. This British policy of divide and rule would create a fractured nation, a time bomb of ethnic tension that would tick for decades, waiting for its moment to detonate. The struggle for independence became the central unifying force, and from this struggle emerged a generation of leaders destined for legend. The most prominent of these was a man named Aung San. Aung San Suu Kyi's father is not merely a historical figure in Myanmar, he is the George Washington, the Simon Bolivar, the unquestioned architect of the nation. In the 1940s, he founded the Burmese Independence Army and skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of World War II, first aligning with the Japanese to oust the British, then turning against them when their imperial ambitions became clear. His charisma and strategic genius were unmatched. In 1947, he successfully negotiated the Panglong Agreement, a landmark deal that promised autonomy to the ethnic minority states in a future federal union. He seemed poised to lead the nation he had fought so hard to free. But tragedy struck on July 19, 1947. Aung San, along with 6 of his closest cabinet members, was assassinated in Rangoon by political rivals. He was just 32 years old. His death, just months before Burma achieved full independence, immortalized him as an unblemished martyr. For his daughter, Suu Kyi, who was only 2 years old at the time, her father would never be a real man with flaws and complexities. He was a ghost, a symbol, an impossible standard of patriotic sacrifice against which she would measure her entire life. His legacy was both her greatest inheritance and her heaviest burden. In the vacuum left by Aung San's death, the fledgling Union of Burma stumbled. A brief period of parliamentary democracy was fraught with instability and the unresolved grievances of the ethnic minorities. In 1962, the military, led by General Ne Win, staged a coup, citing the need to prevent the disintegration of the Union. He instituted the Burmese way to socialism, a bizarre and disastrous blend of Marxist economics, extreme nationalism, and autarky that plunged one of Southeast Asia's most promising nations into decades of isolation and poverty. The military, known as the Tatmadaw, entrenched itself as the sole power broker, ruling with an iron fist through a pervasive secret police force and a culture of fear. Dissent was crushed. The economy crumbled. And the world largely forgot about Burma. Meanwhile, Aung San Suu Kyi was living a life far removed from the strife of her homeland. After her father's death, her mother, Kin Chi, was appointed as Burma's ambassador to India, and Suu Kyi was educated in Delhi before moving to Oxford University in England. It was here that she met her future husband, the brilliant Tibetan scholar Michael Aris. They married and built a life of academic comfort, raising two sons, Alexander and Kim, in a quiet Oxford suburb. For years, she was an academic, a wife, a mother, a seemingly ordinary life for someone with such an extraordinary name. But the ghost of her father and the call of her homeland were never far away. She wrote extensively on Burmese history and politics, a quiet study that was, unbeknownst to her, a preparation for a destiny she had not yet chosen. The catalyst arrived in 1988. Suu Kyi returned to Yangon, formerly Rangoon, to care for her ailing mother. Her timing was cosmically fateful. The country was erupting. Decades of economic misery and political oppression had boiled over into massive pro-democracy demonstrations. Students, monks, and ordinary citizens flooded the streets, demanding an end to military rule. The movement, known as the 8888 Uprising for the date of its largest protests, August 8, 1988, was met with unspeakable brutality. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed crowds, killing thousands. The streets ran with blood. The nation was leaderless and terrified. It was in this maelstrom of hope and violence that Aung San Suu Kyi was thrust into history. Despite her private life, her name held magical power. She was the daughter of Aung San. Invited to speak at the Shwedagon Pagoda, the nation's most sacred site, she addressed a crowd of several 100,000 people. She was slight, elegant, and soft-spoken, but her words were electric. She spoke not with the rage of a revolutionary, but with the calm, unwavering authority of her father's legacy. She called for a democratic government and nonviolent resistance, echoing the principles of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Almost overnight, she became the unifying symbol the movement desperately needed. The military junta, now calling itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council, SLORC, was terrified of her. They placed her under house arrest in 1989, hoping to cut the head off the movement. They believed that out of sight would mean out of mind. They could not have been more wrong. The years of house arrest forged her international image as a modern-day saint. Confined to her dilapidated family villa on Inya Lake, she became a global symbol of peaceful resistance against tyranny. The military offered her a deal: leave the country and you will be free. She refused, knowing she would never be allowed to return. In a heart-wrenching decision, she chose her nation over her family. When her husband, Michael Aris, was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer in 1997, the junta denied him a visa to visit her one last time. They cynically told her she was free to leave to see him, knowing she would be exiled. She stayed. He died in Oxford on his 53rd birthday in 1999, never seeing his wife again. This immense personal sacrifice cemented her image in the West as a figure of almost unimaginable moral fortitude. In 1991, while still under house arrest, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee praised her nonviolent struggle for democracy and human rights. She was placed in the same pantheon as Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama. The world's adoration was absolute. She was the hero, the damsel in distress, the unwavering voice in the darkness. For 15 out of 21 years, she remained a prisoner in her own home, a symbol of goodness imprisoned by evil. This was the flawless first act of her story. The second act began with cautious hope. International pressure and internal dynamics eventually forced the junta's hand. They orchestrated a slow, controlled transition to a quasi-civilian government, drafting a new constitution in 2008 that guaranteed the military permanent political power and immunity from prosecution. It was a deeply flawed document, but it created a narrow opening. In 2010, Suu Kyi was finally released from house arrest. Her party, the National League for Democracy, NLD, participated in elections and won a landslide victory in 2015. After decades of struggle, the hero had seemingly triumphed. She could not become president due to a constitutional clause barring those with foreign family members, a clause written specifically for her, so she assumed the newly created role of state councilor, de facto leader of the country. The world watched with bated breath. The saint was now in charge. The fairy tale was reaching its climax. But this is where the story fractures. This is where the symbol collided with the messy, brutal, and intractable reality of governing Myanmar. The first cracks in her heroic facade appeared not with a bang, but with a wary silence. For years, reports had been emerging from Rakhine State, a restive region in western Myanmar, of persecution against the Rohingya Muslim minority. The Rohingya, a people of South Asian descent, have lived in the region for generations, but the military and many in the Burman Buddhist majority view them as illegal Bengali immigrants. They were denied citizenship under a 1982 law, rendering them stateless. For decades, they faced systemic discrimination, restrictions on movement, and violence. The Tatmadaw had long used them as a bogeyman to stoke Buddhist nationalism and consolidate its own power. As Suu Kyi transitioned from prisoner to ruler, the military's campaigns grew more severe. Then, in August 2017, the nightmare reached its horrifying apex. Following attacks by a small Rohingya militant group on police posts, the Myanmar military launched a campaign of utter annihilation. It was a disproportionate response of breathtaking cruelty. Soldiers systematically burned hundreds of villages. They gang-raped women and girls. They massacred men, women, and children, often throwing their bodies into mass graves. Over 700,000 Rohingya people fled across the border into Bangladesh, carrying with them testimonies of unspeakable horror. The United Nations, human rights groups, and U.S. officials would later call it a textbook case of ethnic cleansing with genocidal intent. The world now turned to its hero. It waited for the moral voice that had championed human rights for decades to speak out, to condemn the butchers in uniform, to protect the vulnerable. That voice never came. Instead, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Laureate, offered a chilling silence, followed by a litany of dismissals, denials, and deflections. She dismissed credible reports of atrocities as fake news. She refused to even utter the word Rohingya, instead referring to them as Muslims from Rakhine State, implicitly validating the government's position that they are foreign interlopers. In a televised address, she acknowledged possible human rights abuses but spoke of terrorists and the complexity of the situation, offering a both-sidesism that was morally bankrupt in the face of a clear, one-sided campaign of slaughter. The international community was stunned. Awards were stripped from her. Honorary citizenship was revoked. Former admirers, from fellow Nobel laureates to world leaders, expressed their utter disgust and betrayal. The icon was now a pariah. In December 2019, she traveled to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to personally defend Myanmar against charges of genocide. She stood before the world's highest court and, with a steely, unapologetic demeanor, argued that the military was merely conducting legitimate counterinsurgency operations. She claimed the evidence was incomplete and misleading. For many who had once revered her, it was the final, unforgivable act. The hero had not just remained silent, she had become the chief apologist for the perpetrators. How does one explain this catastrophic moral collapse? How does the student of Gandhi become the defender of genocide? The answer is not simple, and it lies in the tragic intersection of personal history, realpolitik, and national identity. Firstly, one must understand that Aung San Suu Kyi is, at her core, a Burmese nationalist. Her father's life's work was building a unified Burmese nation. The military has spent decades crafting a narrative where the central Burman state is under constant threat from foreign-backed ethnic minorities. Suu Kyi, despite being the military's prisoner, seems to have internalized this deep-seated suspicion of outsiders and a primary commitment to preserving the Union above all else. To champion the cause of the Rohingya, a group widely despised within Myanmar, would have been political suicide. It would have alienated her Buddhist base and played directly into the military's hands, giving them a pretext to remove her from power. Secondly, she was never truly in power. The 2008 constitution ensured the military, or Tatmadaw, retained control of the key ministries of defense, home affairs, and border affairs, as well as a quarter of all parliamentary seats, giving them an effective veto on any constitutional change. She was navigating an impossible situation, a fragile power-sharing agreement with the very generals who had imprisoned her. Some analysts argue her silence was a pragmatic, if cynical, strategy to maintain a sliver of civilian space and avoid provoking a full military takeover. She chose, they argue, to sacrifice the Rohingya to save the broader, albeit limited, democratic project for the Burman majority. Thirdly, there is the personal element. After decades of sacrifice and struggle, she had finally achieved a semblance of the power her father had dreamed of. To risk it all for a marginalized group that held no political capital for her may have been a calculation she was unwilling to make. The idealist of 1988 had been replaced by a calculating politician of 2017, hardened by years of imprisonment and the brutal realities of power. The final, bitter irony of her tragedy arrived on February 1, 2021. The same military she had defended, the same institution whose genocide she had denied, turned on her once again. Citing baseless allegations of voter fraud in the NLD's landslide 2020 election victory, the Tatmadaw staged a coup. Soldiers once more patrolled the streets. Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested in the dead of night, along with President Win Myint and most of the civilian government. She was returned to the status of a prisoner, this time not in her home but in a series of unknown locations and prisons. The fragile democratic experiment was over. The Tatmadaw had never relinquished its power, it had merely loaned a fraction of it, and now it was taking it back. As of this recording, Aung San Suu Kyi remains a prisoner of the state. She has been convicted on a litany of absurd and trumped-up charges, from illegally importing walkie-talkies to corruption, and sentenced to decades in prison. The woman who failed to stop a genocide is now a victim of the very machine that carried it out. Her fall from global icon to political prisoner is a Shakespearean-level tragedy of almost unbearable proportions. So, we are left with the haunting question posed by our title: who is Aung San Suu Kyi? Is she the hero, the failed leader, or the tragic victim? The uncomfortable, necessary truth is that she is all three. She is the hero who inspired a nation and captivated the world with her dignity and sacrifice. She is the leader who failed her most basic moral test when faced with the persecution of the vulnerable. And she is the victim of the ruthless military apparatus that has defined Myanmar for over half a century. Her story is a devastating lesson in the corrupting nature of power, the complexity of nationalism, and the immense distance between being a symbol of resistance and being an effective, moral leader. It forces us to reconcile the good a person has done with the evil they have enabled. It is a story without easy answers, a life that defies simple categorization. Aung San Suu Kyi is not a monster. She is a profoundly human figure, brilliant, determined, flawed, and ultimately broken by the impossible contradictions of her country and her own legacy. She is the hero who failed, and her tragedy is not hers alone, it is the tragedy of Myanmar itself, a nation forever on the precipice of freedom, forever pulled back into the darkness by the chains of its own history.